Hello learners, welcome to the 20th lecture in this NPTEL course on 20th century poetry. In the previous lecture, I introduced Edna St. Vincent Millay, provided a brief biographical and professional overview to this poet, and began with a detailed reading and commentary on the very first poem in this poet's career, Renascence. I will continue that discussion, wind up with this poem, and read one more long narrative poem which follows Renascence in her first book publication. So, the moment at which I stopped in the previous lecture was the moment when the narrator or the poetic persona of Renascence becomes conscious that having the power to perceive and understand the causes behind every occurrence in this universe fills her with guilt and is extremely uncomfortable at that realization. This is how the poet continues to describe her crisis. And all the while, for every grief, each suffering, I craved relief, with individual desire, craved all in vain, and felt fierce fire. About 1,000 people crawl, perished with each, then mourned for all. So, with great power to perceive things comes a compulsion or an impulse to mourn for every tragedy. And this goes against the very assumption, which is that with great power should come some indifference. And this indifference is what the poet utterly fails to cultivate. The poet is everything but indifferent. In fact, the poet seems to have undergone an intensification in her ability to perceive and in her sensitivity to the kind of suffering, pain, and discomfort that she sees. So not only does the poet have the capacity to perceive things, but these perceptions, these observations of suffering intensify the kind of sympathy and the kind of desire to mourn that the poet experiences. She then gives us some examples of things that she would like to mourn. A man was starving in Capri. He moved his eyes and looked at me. I felt his gaze, I heard his moan, and knew his hunger as my own. I saw at sea a great fog bank between two ships that struck and sank. 1,000 screams the heavens smote, and every scream tore through my throat. No hurt I did not feel, no death that was not mine. Mine each last breath that, crying, met an answering cry. From the compassion that was I. All suffering mine, mine its rod, mine pity like the pity of God. So let us run through these examples first. These examples cover the gamut from individual to public tragedies. An individual tragedy is that of a man starving in Capri who moves his eyes, and the poet says, looked at me. How does the man look at the poet? This is a bit of a mystery at this point, but it will be clarified soon enough. The poet, with her godlike eye, sees everything very closely, right? And responds to the suffering of this starving, hungry, dying man as if it is a discomfort that she herself is going through. Unlike this individual tragedy, there is also a public tragedy, right? That is a mishap at sea in which two ships, blinded by a great dense fog, right, crash into each other, capsize, people drown, right, and 1,000 screams the heavens smote. That is, two ships crashing into each other in the middle of the deep sea, right? It is sort of an unknown public tragedy in a time before electronic media, before the internet, without real-time communication, it's almost as if this tragedy did not occur, right? So that is what the phrase heaven's smote means. And yet the poet, with her godlike perception, perceives this tragedy. Every scream, right? Each of those 1,000 screams, each of those 1,000 people who drowned seems to tear through the poet's consciousness as if it was an individual, personal tragedy. Right? The poet seems to be disorienting, seems to be unraveling. Right? The poet seems to be unable to possess this power because this power is turning on herself. She is unable to perceive this without experiencing what she is perceiving. Right? In a way, this is what makes her such an acute observer. This is what makes her such an astute writer. Right? This is a kind of imagination that would make her a very persuasive writer. And yet, this is causing her a great deal of discomfort because she is unable to perform the role that her power is giving her. What is this role? The role that her power is giving her is that of a dispassionate observer. And she's failing to remain dispassionate. She's failing to observe without experiencing that which she observes. Okay? All suffering mine its rod. Mine its rod, what does it mean? It means she realizes that as a godlike power, she has the power to produce the suffering that people are going through. And yet, when she perceives the suffering, her perspective changes from that of a dispassionate, judicious, indifferent God and becomes that of a sensitive poet. So she writes, mine its rod, mine pity like the pity of God. Right? So God's pity, right? This is a strange phrase to use. God's pity is very, very measured. God's pity does not overflow. God's pity is very, very stoic. The poet's pity, on the other hand, is extremely different. It overflows. It capsizes the poet's brain. It causes the poet a great deal of trouble because she realizes that she can only witness without stopping the suffering that other people are going through. So this is the situation that the poet is in, and she will struggle to resolve it. How does she struggle to resolve it? Does she resolve it? Ah, awful weight, infinity pressed down upon the finite me. My anguished spirit like a bird beating against my lips I heard. Yet lay the weight so close about, there was no room for it without. So beneath the weight lay I, and suffered death but could not die. This is the key to the understanding the title of the poem Renascence. Renascence literally means the revival. It can also mean in different contexts the rebirth. It can also mean the rejuvenation or bringing back to life or bringing back to vitality and activity something that has lain either dead or inactive and dormant, depending on the context. The word Renaissance was also used to describe a period of literary and cultural history. That is, early modern literature is often called to be writing during the period of the Renaissance. This is because at a certain point in the 16th and 17th centuries in Europe, the literature and the art of the classical era, that is Greek and Roman literature and art, enjoyed a renewed attention. That is why we call William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe to be writers of the Renaissance. In that instance, Renaissance refers to a rebirth of the cultural value of writing and art that had been considered to be dead or useless or dormant. In this poem, the word Renaissance describes the revival and the rebirth, not just of the life of the poet. It's not that the poet has died and is brought back to life like Jesus Christ um, on Good Friday and Easter Monday, but it is rather a case of the poet reviving her consciousness. This revival of the poet's consciousness has to do with the way the poet experiences and observes mortality. The fact that everyone who lives will die and no one can escape that mortal limit. In this stanza, the poet describes that she suffers death but could not die. That is, because of the expansion in her cognitive and intellectual capacity, she is able to observe things. Because she has the sensitivity of a writer, she doesn't simply observe things, but experiences them. So when she observes people suffering, people dying, she feels that she is dying herself. And she would like to die, because to experience what she observes is the first step to writing about it accurately. And yet she feels that she cannot die. Now, this phrase, could not die, can be interpreted in two ways. In the first sense, the poet cannot die because the poet is not factually in those scenarios. The poet is reading about the hungry man in Capri. The poet is thinking about the ships capsizing, the people drowning. The poet is not factually present in those circumstances, so the poet cannot actually die. This is one sense in which we can understand this phrase. Another sense in which we can understand this phrase is that the poet imagines what it would be like to be God. The poet imaginatively transports herself to that of an omniscient observer. This explains that scream that the poet let out in the second stanza. Simply an act of perceiving the sky, raising her hand, extending her hand to cover the sky, produces an intellectual and almost metaphysical shift in the poet's perspective. So if this were a science fictional or a magic realistic universe, we could imagine that the poet has become God. It is the God who is unhappy at this condition of being able to observe death, feeling the pain and the trauma of those who are dying, but unable to share with them because God is immortal. So this is the poet's dilemma, feeling a great deal of pathos, but unable to follow through and share the experience of those who are suffering. The poet writes, "Long had I lain thus, craving death, when quietly the earth beneath gave way, and inch by inch, so great, at last had grown the crushing weight. Into the earth I sank till I, full 6 feet under ground did lie, and sank no more. There is no weight can follow here, however great. From off my breast I felt it roll, and as it went, my tortured soul burst forth and fled in such a gust that all about me swirled dust. Deep in the earth I rested now, cool is its hand upon the brow, and soft its breast beneath the head of one who is so gladly dead. And all at once and over all the pitying rain began to fall. I lay and heard each pattering hoof upon my lowly thatched roof, and seemed to love the sound far more than ever I had done before. For rain it hath a friendly sound to one who's 6 feet underground, and scarce the friendly voice or face. A grave is such a quiet place." So a strange thing has happened, and these two stanzas can only be interpreted in the magic realist or science fictional frame. A change has occurred, right? The poet has been craving death, right? And the universe grants her her wish. The earth swallows her, and the poet lies both alive and dead underground, feels the rain caress the ground softly, and is actually quite happy that she is dead, because being dead means that she is freed from the intellectual burden, the remorse, the guilt which she described earlier, that came with omniscience, that came with understanding. Uh, Death seems to bring with it the inability to perceive certain things. It brings with it an ignorance which is quite welcome, right? And further, she writes, and scarce the friendly voice or face, a grave is such a quiet place. Right? Uh, the grave is a place of great comfort. Right? Uh, Literally speaking, the fact that the poet can write this sentence means that the poet is not actually dead, quite literally. Uh, Death then is a metaphor for a particular way of perceiving reality. The poet here is grateful for a limitation to her capacity to perceive. The poet then writes, "The rain, I said, is kind to come and speak to me in my new home. I would I were alive again, to kiss the fingers of the rain, drink into my eyes the shine of every slanting silver line, to catch the freshened, fragrant breeze from drenched and dripping apple trees. For soon the shower will be done, and then the broad face of the sun will laugh above the rain-soaked earth, until the world with answering mirth shakes joyously, and each round drop rolls twinkling from its grass blade top. How can I bear it, buried here, while overhead the sky grows clear and blue again after the storm? O multicolored, multiform, beloved beauty over me, that I shall never, never see again. Spring silver, autumn gold, that I shall never more behold, sleeping your myriad magics through, close sepulchred away from you." So the poet then seems to regret that what has happened to her, this ignorance, the limitation to her infinite capacity to perceive, the fact that the poet has been buried under the earth despite not being dead. Right? This is another problem. The poet wishes for the material joys, the tactile joys that comes with being alive, though mortal. Right? The changes of the seasons, the way the earth, the way the trees, the way the natural world changes with time every year in a cyclical manner. Silver spring, autumn gold, the way these colors and seasons change. The poet would like to experience these things. The poet would like to be immortal, value these things while they last, and is quite happy to give up on the expanded sensibility that was given to her. So the poet then writes, "O God," I cried, "give me new birth and put me back upon the earth. Upset each cloud's gigantic gird, and let the heavy rain downpoured in one big torrent set me free, washing my grave away from me." I ceased, and though the breathless hush that answered me, the far-off rush of herald wings came whispering like music down the vibrant string of my ascending prayer, and crash. Before the wild wind's whistling lash, the startled storm clouds reared on high and plunged in terror down the sky. And the big rain in one black wave fell from the sky and struck my grave. So, in response to her prayer, the poet finds an extremely powerful storm occurs, right? And the soft and comforting rain is replaced by a powerful terror that rains down from the sky. And this washes the poet's grave away. Again, sticking with the science fictional or magic realistic narrative, the poet who had been granted immortality, the ability to perceive everything in the universe, omniscience, this poet had longed for death, had longed for mortality, as a result had been buried alive, had regretted further that being buried alive, she was denied the tangible pleasures that came with being on earth, being alive on earth, pleasures like perceiving the change of seasons, and had prayed to God again to be born again, right? To be born again as a mortal. And that wish, that prayer was answered again. A violent storm occurs and washes the poet's grave away, right? Let us continue reading and we will sum up the poet's resolution after the poem closes. I know not how such things can be. I only know there came to me a fragrance such as never clings to aught save happy living things. A sound as of some joyous elf singing sweet songs to please himself. And through and over everything, a sense of glad awakening. The grass a tiptoe at my ear, whispering to me I could hear. I felt the rain's cool fingertips brushed tenderly across my lips, laid gently on my sealed sight. And all at once the heavy night fell from my eyes and I could see a drenched and dripping apple tree, a last long line of silver rain, a sky grown clear and blue again. And as I looked, a quickening gust of wind blew up to me and thrust into my face a miracle of orchard breath. And with the smell, I know not how such things can be, I breathed my soul back into me. Right? So, the poet describes getting her life back. The poet describes somehow the universe contriving to reverse the change that had occurred. The poet describes how she retains her mortal, limited ability to perceive the world. That is conveyed in the phrase, the orchard breath. Right? The wind that blows into her face is described as an orchard breath. The wind that has blown through an orchard, carrying some of the smell of fruits in bloom, ripe and ripening fruits, that smell, that unmistakable smell of change, of the passage of time. As time passes, as the seasons change, as plants grow and as plants renew each other themselves through flowers and fruits, right? That change, that process, there are only a limited number of years that a human body can survive. And because of that limit, those years are valued. That limit, that value, is what the poet perceives when she feels that wind, which is like an orchard breath on her face. Right? And then further she describes, up then from the ground sprang I, and hailed the earth with such a cry, as is not heard, save from a man who has been dead and lives again. About the trees my arms I wound, like one gone mad, I hugged the ground. I raised my quivering arms on high, I laughed and laughed into the sky. Till at my throat a strangling sob caught fiercely, and a great heart throb set instant tears into my eyes. O God, I cried, no dark disguise can ever hereafter hide from me thy radiant identity. So this is a key sentence, and we will think a little bit about what this means. She hugs the trees, she hugs the ground, right? And then she is grateful, right? She is changed in her perception of what the power, the omniscience, the knowledge that being God brings. She addresses God and cries out, no dark disguise can ever hereafter hide from me thy radiant identity. So earlier, she had become God and had regretted receiving that power because she could not manage to simply observe without feeling kind of disabling guilt. She gave up that power. She refused to be God. She refused to have the power that only God has. She was granted that wish. She was grateful to be immortal. And now, having become a mortal, right, having received the ability to perceive the passage of time as a human being, she has a renewed appreciation for what the other perspective empowers someone else to do. She says that no dark disguise can hide from me the radiant identity. God's identity has become radiant. Right? In this moment, the work of Edna St. Vincent Millay, this is the poet who is beginning her career. We can very clearly trace the literary genealogy. We can trace the ancestors, the poetic grandmothers, or the literary heritage that this poet is working with. And one poet whose writing is reflected very powerfully in these lines is that of the Victorian poet Christina Rossetti. The appreciation of nature, the appreciation of mortality, and the perception of a cosmic, spiritual, godlike, divine power through the perception of nature. That is essentially the kind of intellectual and emotional labor that we find in the work of Christina Rossetti, repeated across her poems throughout her oeuvre. And this is exactly what we find in this moment in the work of this young American poet. Now, Edna St. Vincent Millay will move far beyond this appreciation of God through a perception of nature. But it is a very powerful beginning. Some of this appreciation of God will remain, and although concerns will replace this appreciation of God, we will return to this humility, this intellectual humility, this gratitude for a limited perception that we see here. But let us quickly wrap up this poem. Thou canst not move across the grass, but my quick eyes will see thee pass, nor speak, however silently, but my hushed voice will answer thee. I know the path that tells thy way through the cool eve of every day. God, I can push the grass apart and lay my finger on thy heart. So an extremely strange articulation of power. The poet is not God. The poet is a mere mortal. And yet, the experience the poet has had, the brief moment of looking at the world from God's perspective, has given the poet the power to perceive God. Right? God cannot escape the poet. The dynamic has changed. Right? The poet has become more powerful than she was. Her perception, her ability to perceive has expanded. She has not given up all of that omniscience. Some of that expanded capacity to perceive remains. But there's a difference between the kind of omniscience that God has, which the poet shied away from, which the poet was very, very loath to keep, and the kind of omniscience that the poet now has. God's omniscience is active. God moves and speaks, whereas the poet receives and responds to that action. God moves and the poet's eyes see. God speaks and the poet's hushed voice answers. So there is a difference. The poet is omniscient and powerful, has an expanded sensory, cognitive toolkit, but this power, this expansion of her intellectual powers can only work in response to another higher power, that of God. So while God's omniscience is active, the poet's omniscience is passive. It is this passive omniscience that defines the work of this young poet in this first collection. And we will now read the last stanza to wrap up this lecture. The world stands out on either side, no wider than the heart is wide, and above the world is stretched the sky, no higher than the soul is high. The heart can push the sea and land farther away on either hand. The soul can split the sky in two and let the face of God shine through. But east and west will pinch the heart that cannot keep them pushed apart. And he whose soul is flat, the sky will cave in on him by and by. The poet ends this long reflection of changing her ability to perceive the world and coming back to life with a renewed capacity to perceive the world around her. The poet ends this by giving the primary importance and power not to an extraordinary, supernatural, or divine force, but simply the power of an individual mind. Soul is the word that's used here. The soul can split. Heart is a word that's used here. The heart can push the sea and land. These words, soul and heart, refer to the poet's imagination. It is the poet's ability to change what appears ordinary and make it appear and make it feel extraordinary. So here, the young poet is in love with poetry more than anything else. The experience of religiosity, the spiritual subservience to God is actually calculated to underline something much more secular and much more practical, which is that the keenness with which an individual mind perceives the world and the proficiency with which this mind articulates those observations, those are what make for great poetry as well as the approximation of divinity. We will continue reading work from Renaissance. Specifically, we will read one more poem from Renaissance before moving on to Sonnets by Edna, St. Vincent Millay in the next lecture. Thank you.